there. Welcome. I'm glad you are here for today's lesson. We've got some interesting things that are going to go on today, and I will start off by saying that if you've been listening to the most recent lessons, then you know that we've been talking about Jesus being born and some of the things with him growing up and as he's getting ready to begin his ministry. Um, the last time we talked about him being baptized by the person we know as John the Baptist, who was his relative, and the temptation he went through. Now, Jesus is ready to start his ministry. As I was reading through the different writings, the scriptures for this, one thing for you to know, if you don't already, is that the story of Jesus's time on earth is in four different books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the way they wrote their books, they emphasize different things or they put things in a different order, maybe not even the order that things happen. This is not too unusual. We have that in books now. If you read a true story of someone, a lot of times they'll start with something exciting, then go back and tell you how it began, how it was with that person being born and growing up. In the movies, the same way. You'll see something, there'll be an exciting scene, and then they'll stop and say 2 years earlier or 6 months earlier, and they'll go back and bring the story forward. And that's to kind of get you into the story and realize that, okay, this is something I want to see or read. And the Bible writers did similar things. So it's a little bit difficult to know the exact order things came in. Um, but just to know they didn't think the order was as important as you knowing this. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now, when Jesus finished his time in the wilderness, apparently he went back to where John was because John saw him and he made a comment. Now, one of the things that would happen with some of these great religious teachers is since they didn't always have special schools for people to go to. In fact, if they did not go to the temple to study under some of the teachers there, the way a person would learn about how to tell people about God and learn the way they're supposed to talk to people and how to do it well was to find someone who was doing it and stay with that person. And a lot of times you'll hear the word apprentice used, and that's an accurate term. For religious people, normally you would say a disciple, and that's someone who is learning from the teacher, and then he will be able to turn around and teach people himself. So very common back then, still done some today, but very common in those days. And John had his own disciples, and one of them was named John. So in order to keep it straight, Jesus's cousin we call John the Baptist, and then there's another fellow named John, and we will just call him John. Well, John the Baptist saw Jesus, and he had a couple of his disciples there. There's Andrew, and then John, and he said, "Oh, the Lamb of God." And I go, that's, that seems interesting because they know that's supposed to be somebody important. And if you remember, John was given information by God that he would know who the Messiah was when he baptized him, and he knew, John the Baptist knew that Jesus was that person. So they go following Jesus. And this is where you get a lot of different stories told about how Jesus picked up what we call the 12 disciples. And in the Bible itself, they'll refer to these men as the 12 a lot of times. And the way it looks from what I was reading is there are about three different ways you can follow Jesus. And in those days, three different ways. One of them was to listen to what he had to say and then try to live your life by what he said. So you're following Jesus even though you've just heard him maybe one time, but you're trying to do what he was telling you to do to serve God. And then there was the second type those would be people who would be called by Jesus, and then they would be sent out with a special mission to do something for a period of time. And then when that was over, they would go back to what they had been doing, such as whatever job they had or going back to where they actually lived. And then the third type were the kind that I referred to as disciples earlier, who would come to Jesus and they wanted to learn everything they could about God in doing that. And so it seems like some of these people he called, but they were not called to be that last group just yet. And he ended up picking 12. Most people think that was because 12 was a special number to the Israelites, part of it being the number of tribes there had been. So um, the first two, uh, I count as the first two, being Andrew and John, because John the Baptist sent them, referred to him. But Jesus started seeking out people and calling them to him. And so now I'm going to show you a list. This list is, okay, that just does fit in there. This is something you can freeze the frame on, because not only is this a list of the disciples, but it is also the lyrics to a song I came up with so I could remember all of their names. And I did not know at the time there was already a 12 Disciples song, but what I did, I said, well, 12 Disciples, there's a song called the 12 Days of Christmas. That'll be a tune I can use for this. And I use that to help me remember their names and a little bit about them. So I start off with John, this being, he had been working for John the Baptist. And the fact I remember about him is that he's one of the sons of Zebedee. Now, he has a brother named James, and their dad is named Zebedee, and they were fishermen working in the Sea of Galilee. And that was the family business. And eventually, the two of them followed Jesus after he came along and said, you come with me, I'll make you fishers of men. Well, their partners in that were Andrew, we've already talked about a little bit, and his brother, Peter. Now, Peter was actually named Simon, and eventually Jesus gives him the name Peter, and that's what he's known by. Peter means rock, and so they'll come into play later on. Then I mentioned James being brother to John, and with James, the thing I remember about him is that Jesus ends up calling him a son of thunder along with John. In fact, when I go back to this, we see that we have John's a son of Zebedee. So is James, but they're also called sons of thunder because there's this time they wanted to blow up a town, and we'll talk about that in a future lesson. So I think that was the time Jesus was making a joke with them. Of course, we have Andrews the fisher and then Simon Peter. So all four of these are fishermen. Now, they had a friend named Philip, and he had a friend named Nathaniel. So interesting thing. So I said Philip is Nate's friend. That's short for Nathaniel. And then Nathaniel was sitting under a fig tree, and then Philip came along to tell him, "Oh, we think we found the Messiah, and it's Jesus." And turns out, he's from Nazareth. And Nathaniel's going, anything good come out of Nazareth? Because Nazareth was considered a pretty bad place. And they didn't think anybody who would be the Messiah would be coming out of a place like Nazareth. And so later on, he sees Jesus, and Jesus says, "Oh, yeah, I saw you when you were under the fig tree." Nathaniel's surprised by this. Now, Nathaniel is sometimes listed as Bartholomew. So he could go by either name. Now, the Bar in Bartholomew means son of, so the Lemu part would have been his father's name. So Nathaniel's his name, but he's also known by his dad. And then there's Thomas after that. Now, Thomas, a lot of people think badly of him because they call him a doubter. Jesus is killed later on, and then he's back alive, and everybody tells him Jesus is alive again. He doesn't believe it. He won't believe it until he sees Jesus for himself. And it would be kind of hard for any of us to believe someone was alive again if we knew that person had died. So Thomas does have some good things he says all through the Bible, and I kind of like him in that. Then there's Matthew, who is also known as Levi, and he was a tax man, and that was a job um, you could make money at, but people did not like you. So when he had a chance to follow Jesus, he got up and went right away. Oh, and one thing with Thomas I forgot to mention to you is that he was a twin. His other name was Didymus, which means twin. So we'll move down. There's another fellow named James in the group. So there's James, son of thunder, who's John's brother, and then there's James Bar Alphaeus, and that just means, if you remember a while ago when we were talking about Bartholomew, his father's name is Alphaeus, so James Bar Alphaeus. Then there's Thaddeus, and the only thing we know about Thaddeus is he was one of Jesus's disciples. Well, if you got to be known for something and there's only one thing to remember about you, that's a pretty good thing to remember. Now, next there's Simon the Zealot. So we had two Simons, but since we're going to call Simon Peter Peter, it's easy to keep them separated. Um, Simon was a zealot. Now, at this time, the Roman Empire had taken over and they had soldiers in charge of everything. As we mentioned, they would let other people do the ruling for them as long as those people followed the Roman rules. The Zealots did not like the Romans being there. In fact, they were wanting to throw everybody out who didn't belong to the nation of Israel and have just the Jewish people ruling themselves. And they were looking forward to a Messiah who was going to be a warrior king and do that for them. So it would be easy to see why Simon would be drawn to Jesus because he thinks, okay, this is the person to make it happen. Now, the Zealots also didn't like people who worked for the Romans. So you remember Matthew was a tax man? That meant he was working for the Romans up until he started following Jesus. So Matthew and Simon wouldn't have liked each other very much, at least to start with. Okay, and then the 12th man was Judas. We actually know a last name for him, Judas Iscariot. And there are a few things we end up finding out about him, and that'll be part of stories that come up. But just to know that he's going to be the one to betray Jesus. That's how he is remembered. And it's a sad thing for him, but it was a choice he made. And it's going to really turn out badly for him in the long run. So with that, I'm going to close down this lesson with mention of my tie. So I went with, you may have heard of a game called pool or billiards. And in it, you have a white ball that you use to hit other balls on the table, and there are 15 of those. And you think, well, there are 12 disciples. What's with the 15? Well, there's a special thing about this because there are 15 balls. There's an 8 ball, which is usually considered bad in the games that you play. And I think of Judas when I think of this 8 ball. I think of Jesus as the cue ball. That's the one that's completely white. You hit it to hit the other balls. And then you go 12 to 15. Well, there were more than 12 apostles. Now, we'll say disciples, apostles. A lot of times that means the same thing. Sometimes it means different things. But we'll talk about that in upcoming lessons. Some of you may know about other apostles, but we'll get to 15 before this is all over. But that'll be for a future lesson. For now, I'm going to let you go, and I hope you'll be back for the next lesson. Bye.